Well, welcome to everybody. This is a very important and interesting subject for this webinar, and we've got a very good collection of panelists to discuss it. Wasundhara Doradenia is our policy analyst at ADBA, and she will be doing the introductory presentation on the potential for transport of biomethane in the UK. I'll introduce people as they come round, I think, but just to say on the panel we have Richard Guterbach, who's Director of Food Chains and has a lot of experience seeing the space from every which angle, including a policy one, I think, Richard. So, will bring a very good perspective. Rob Wood, the CEO of GasRec, looking at gas fueling infrastructure and what might need to be done there and the roadmap out to 2050. And Philip Fiel of CNG Fuels, looking at the market state of biomethane as a transport fuel. And as always with these things, we will be not just talking about the potential, but also attempting to identify roadblocks and what we need to do to get around them, as well as the potential upside. So, Wason, do you want to kick us off with your presentation? This is, I should say, before anything else, a panel hosted by ADBA, the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association, as part of Decarbonising Transport Week. I'm delighted, by the way, that we're participating in this. As a former Secretary of State for the Department of Energy and Climate Change, now invented with an entirely unpronounceable acronym, which sounds a bit like, for those of us of a certain age, DESI-ARNAS. But what I would say is that it is particularly important to shift the policy focus onto transport, because transport has been an area which has showed relatively slow progress on the decarbonisation agenda. I'm not naming any names or pack drill, but it's certainly the case that usually Secretaries of State for the Department of Transport have other concerns highest on their list of priorities, like keeping the trains running and getting people into work and so forth, rather than decarbonisation. So hopefully we can help change that. And at that point, Wason, why don't I kick over to you and give us your presentation? Thanks.
Yeah, I will share the screen and let's see. Oh, something is happening. 1 second. Can
That's
everyone
good.
see it?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So, okay, let me full screen it. Cool. So, good morning. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And good morning. I'm Vasundhara, a policy and market analyst with ADBA, and I'm leading the transportation work stream within ADBA. So today I will be talking on behalf of ADBA about the overarching potential of biomethane for the transport sector. Transport is the largest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the UK, and in 2020, the sector produced 406 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which contributed to 24% of the UK's total emissions in the year. However, it's also the slowest sector to reduce emissions since 1990. Speaking about how much it contributes to air pollution, 33% of the nitrogen oxides emissions and 14% of the particulate matter emissions came from the transport sector. And diving into the sector, heavy goods vehicles, or HGVs, are responsible for 17% of these transport emissions. To put it into a bit of context, in 2019, cars made up 79% of the road vehicle miles traveled within the UK, but produced 55% of the transport-related emissions. However, HGVs made up a much smaller proportion of the vehicle miles at 5%, but their emissions were disproportionately greater at 16%. So do we have solutions to address this issue? As you know, the government is considering banning the sale of all new diesel and petrol HGVs by 2030. And since then, electricity and hydrogen have sort of gained spotlight as replacement options. Although it is true that these fuel types are attractive due to the lack of tailpipe emissions, realistically, this could take about 15 to 20 years to be deployed at a significant scale, a scale required for immediate decarbonization. And as you can see here in the slide, when looking at hydrogen and electricity as alternative transport fuels, there are multiple technological, practical, and even sustainability related barriers that needs to be addressed before deploying them at scale. We know that UK needs to decarbonize the sectors immediately. We simply do not have time to wait for alternative technologies to become commercially feasible. In that case, biomethane is the best available and ready to use solution capable of decarbonizing transport immediately. Looking at the statistics here, if we rapidly deploy biomethane, emissions from HGVs could be reduced by 38% by 2030. But if we decide to wait for electric or hydrogen trucks to be deployed, emissions would be cut by just 6% over the same period. The good news is that more HGV fleets are transitioning to biomethane fuels as the companies recognize its ability to deliver a return on investment and cut carbon emissions. Fueling HGVs with biomethane can also cut well-to-wheel emissions by 80% per kilometer driven compared to diesel. These well-to-wheel emissions are the emissions related to fuel production, processing, distribution, and use. I will talk a little bit more about this a bit later in the presentation. Let's dive into why biomethane is the practical and immediate solution to decarbonize the transport sector. Transport sector is arguably one of the hardest to decarbonize sectors. One, biomethane is compatible with the existing infrastructure. So biomethane is chemically identical to fossil natural gas, which means it can be directly injected into the national gas grid and transported across UK and Europe without having to invest in new infrastructure. Two, it has continuous growing supply. Anaerobic digestion or AD plants recycle organic waste to generate biomethane and other bioproducts. Currently, over 715 AD plants are operational across the UK, producing 19.7 terawatt hours of biomethane per year. And this sector only continues to grow each year with a growing potential to supply biomethane to fuel over 67% of the HGVs at the sector's full potential. And number three, utilization. There are already over 600 gas-fueled HGVs operating in UK, and this number is growing rapidly. Major industry players like Asda and John Lewis have already transitioned from diesel to gas-fueled trucks, and also major truck producers like Volvo and Scania, they have models that are compatible with biomethane gas-fueled engines. Moving on to the current state and the future potential of biomethane in the transport sector. Currently, the energy consumption by the HGV sector in the UK is 81 terawatt hours, while the AD sector generate, like I mentioned before, 19.7 terawatt hours. This is enough biogas to fuel 24% of all HGVs operating in the UK. At full potential, whereby all readily available organic wastes are recycled through AD, an estimated 54.5 terawatt hours of biomethane can be produced each year. This is enough to fuel over 67% of all HGVs in the UK. And talking about the greenhouse gas emission savings, currently the AD sector contributes to 5.1 megatons of equivalent greenhouse gas savings across the UK, which this translates to 5.2% of the total greenhouse gas emissions from the UK's domestic transport sector. But at full potential, the AD sector can save over 23% of domestic transport-related greenhouse gas emissions, which is a significant portion. So what is acting as pull drivers for this biomethane in transport from reaching its potential? In November 2021, the UK government confirmed that all new heavy goods vehicles in the UK will be zero emission by 2040. One thing to understand about HGVs is that compared to cars, the decarbonization of HGVs is much more challenging. Due to their heavier weight, they need significantly more power. And as HGVs travel long distances, it is impractical to do frequent recharging. Last week, the Transport Committee published a report, Fueling the Future. In this report, the committee quotes Logistics UK, one of the largest trade association for freight transport, stating that UK is still a long way away from having a reliable, market-ready, zero-emission HGV that can transport goods across the entire UK. The committee further recommends in the report that the government must publish a long-term HGV decarbonization strategy as a matter of priority. Aligning with this recommendation, I would really like to re-emphasize that this decision of the government to solely focus on tailpipe emissions, that disregards the major potential of biomethane as a transport fuel in decarbonizing the UK's transport sector, especially HGVs. So the government must make use of this opportunity to reach the sector's decarbonization in time. Looking deeper into the problems with this zero emission vehicle mandate, there are a number of economic and environmental problems in this approach. One, it disregards the fuel's full life cycle emissions or well-to-wheel emissions, essentially failing to account for emissions incurred during the production, transportation, and utilization of these fuels. When designing a policy for the transport sector, it's crucial that the government considers emissions released from well to wheel. Emissions are not limited to a vehicle's exhaust pipe, and so policy targeting transport decarbonization must extend beyond the refueling station. By focusing solely on zero tailpipe HGVs, a vehicle fueled by grey hydrogen or fossil-generated electricity would qualify as a zero-emission vehicle despite their direct contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. So instead of decarbonizing transport, this policy sort of shifts its emissions to the broader energy sector. Two, by focusing only on zero tailpipe emissions, this policy proposal limits future HGV technologies to electricity or hydrogen only, regardless of these fuels' carbon intensity. And three, setting a future ban dissuades these fleets from switching to ready-to-use, low, zero, or even negative carbon technologies, such as biomethane, thus preventing an immediate decarbonization. Next, the lack of technological readiness. So this mandate requires fleet operators to use vehicles which are not yet available on the market. And even if they come available, they may well fall short in terms of the functionality required, which will further delay the decarbonization. Another challenge when deploying zero-emission vehicles at a large scale would be these colossal infrastructure challenges that needs to be addressed. Delivering electricity and hydrogen refueling infrastructure would take decades to complete, like I said before, and it will delay the immediate decarbonization, while also presenting significant costs to taxpayers and companies alike. So all of what I talked about today in this presentation, you can find them in detail in our recent report. Biomethane Fueling a Transport Revolution, which was launched last year, June. This report covers 3 core sections of the issue: the problem, the solution, and the business case. And it demonstrated how biomethane can immediately decarbonize the transport sector while saving fleet operators money. This report includes case studies like CNG Fuels, Air Liquide, Asta, Royal Mail, among others. If you would like to find more information about this, please head over to bioresources.org. And that brings my presentation to an end. Again, my name is Vasundhara and I'm a policy analyst at ADBA. So you can see my email here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And
Thank you, Vas.
Stop.
That's great. That's a very useful and comprehensive overview of the issues involved in the sector. I think it's probably best if we keep all the questions till the end. So maybe we should now move on to our next presentation, which is Richard Guterbach on rural transport and off-grid biomethane for decarbonising transport. Richard, do you want to kick off?
Thanks very much, Chris. I'll try and share my screen. Can people see my screen yet?
Nope.
How about that? Is that working?
I'm afraid not.
Try again.
Ah, there we go. That's it.
Cool. Good. Well, good morning, everybody. I've been delighted to be asked to speak at this important event by Chris and the ADBA team. And unlike Rob and Philip, who are going to speak about the amazing work that they're doing, delivering actual supplies of biomethane for truck fuel operators and extending the network around the country, I want to focus on the rural requirement for biomethane and perhaps the deficit that exists within government policy on supporting the transition to biomethane as a vehicle fuel and indeed gas fuels in general for rural and farm applications. So much of this has been much of what I've been doing recently in my work in this area has been based on a report that I helped co-edit for the Royal Agricultural Society of England on the Farm of the Future Journey to Net Zero, which was published back in this time last year, highlighting the technology shifts that need to be made to enable the rural community and the farming business sector to embrace decarbonisation. And while the report covers a wide diversity of issues ranging from soil health, carbon capture, biodiversity, and the need to help farmers decarbonise by developing demo sites, and a big important part of the issue for the farming community is their dependence on fossil fuels, whether as a source of fertility for crops or indeed the subsidised res diesel supply that farmers rely on. We need to see a systems rethink within the farming community. It is underway. There are some very exciting developments taking place, but we still have to accept that food production is a major user of fossil fuels, and the government and our industry need to work with farmers to help them transition away from red diesel to biomethane and, in some instances, battery electric vehicles. It has to be recognised that the UK, despite the best efforts of ADBA and many people on this webinar, remains behind the curve on biomethane. We've failed as a country to grasp the nettle that has happened in the EU, where we have a rapid drive to expand gas output. And we have, I think, major concerns in this country over food and energy security, which perhaps have not really evolved into real policy transition to broaden out the production of biomethane and biogas in the UK. And we, I think, are all aware of the inequity of the green gas scheme, green gas support scheme, which excludes off-grid biogas. And we have to recognise that, you know, close to 50% of the country, I live in rural Hampshire, I'm not connected to the gas grid in my community, and therefore a policy that focuses exclusively on the gas grid is going to exclude many businesses. And when this is allied with a failure to support small-scale agri-food AD, we have some issues that need to be addressed. Food businesses, farmers need to reduce their scope 3 emissions, and we need to find ways of replacing diesel, not only in food transport, but in the many vehicles that chunder around on our farms doing various jobs, consuming diesel, and are subsidized to do so. And I think the farming community itself, while it may be not keen to move away from the red diesel subsidy just at this moment with the high price of fuels, it does recognize the need that by 2030 or soon after, it will no longer be able to justify the red diesel subsidy. And in delivering that change, I think the focus has to be on developing a diesel gas fuel policy where we focus on the ability of gas fuels led by biomethane, but also including biopropane or LNG and ultimately hydrogen, have a role to play. And this needs to be part of a diesel replacement policy for the UK. I've just put this picture up because it highlights a range of sort of technologies and possibilities that are already out there within the farming community to support decarbonisation. This is one of the infographics developed for the RASE report. And, you know, diesel replacement, whether it's tankers delivering milk or the tractors that are cultivating or moving crops around farms, we need to find alternatives to the current reliance on diesel. This can include anaerobic digestion as a major driver for farm decarbonisation, but likewise there are a wide range of renewable energy options that are available to the farming community, some less developed than others, but again something that needs to be embraced, you know, in over the next decade. Anaerobic digestion is well recognized as being potentially part of what farmers need to do, particularly livestock farmers, as they boost their own on-farm energy supply alongside the other tasks that they are being required to do, including increasing food production. And you know, I think an unrecognized potential is the fact that farmers have traditionally been major contributors of energy within their local area. I mean, we go back to hay for horses if you want to, but even now, many farms have got AD plants, farms have solar and wind potential, and this can be expanded and increased. But I think it needs to be done on the basis that the farmers are the owners and the operators of the plant rather than just renting land to others to install equipment on their farms. There's huge potential to combine AD and other technologies with batteries. I think one of the unrecognized opportunities that is being developed by an exciting company in Scotland called SunAmp is the scope for heat batteries alongside power batteries. And we have the potential to develop a range of uses for biogas produced in rural areas off-grid. And I've emphasized the fact that, you know, we have a focus at the moment on putting biomethane into the grid. It's entirely laudable, but we're excluding large parts of the country. And if we want to put bio-CNG into farm vehicles, we don't need to put it into the grid first, because most farms are not connected to the gas grid. And therefore, we need a rural gas fuel strategy that embraces not only the scope for AD, but also the scope for local hydrogen generation down the line. But And one of the political parties recently announced that they wanted the UK to become a clean energy superpower. Well, that's all well and good, but if we're not going to support rural development of biogas on the areas that are not connected to the gas grid, and if we don't have grant support available and we don't have incentives, we need to have some vision that will allow us to find a route to decarbonising rural Britain. We've had biogas plants on farms for a considerable amount of time. The top image on this slide is about 30 years old. The middle one is a rather more recent innovation by a British company called Biofactory, using containerized systems to turn cow slurry into heat and fuel on farms. And we have increasingly got access to modular, smaller scale upgrade technology that will allow us to do that. But we're faced by what I would refer to as policy blocking. There seems to be a reluctance amongst politicians within government to not only embrace the fact that bio-CNG is a viable diesel replacement in rural areas, but also, I think, an over-focus on the use of electric or battery electric vehicles in solutions where they are patently unsuitable. And it was referred earlier to them not being suitable for long distance haulage in HGVs, in battery electric or even fuel cell options. And that is patently the case in agricultural applications where you need high torque to undertake the tasks that farmers are required to do. And you don't just have to watch Jeremy Clarkson on his wacky farming program to realize that these vehicles are large and heavy and need torque. And biogas is one of the few fuels currently available that can actually deliver this sort of torque. We already have New Holland developing or selling hydrogen, selling biomethane tractors, and I believe that doing that can also help create the pathway to hydrogen fuel supply in rural areas. And of course, we have JCB having developed their hydrogen internal combustion engine, which I will come on to in a while. So here we are again, another of the infographics that we used for the RESE Farm of the Future report. The diversity of potential in terms of getting away from diesel on farms is huge, ranging from small robotics, buzzing around on farm, doing specific tasks, killing weeds, identifying disease, to larger vehicles, also potentially autonomous and fueled with biomethane, doing cultivation tasks, potentially battery electric trucks for delivering farm produce. But ultimately, you know, if you're going to be moving milk tankers around the country or bulkers carrying grain, you're still going to need an internal combustion engine. And they're here and they're already in use. I won't dwell on this slide at great length, but just to say there are biofuel tractor options out there. We have the New Holland Bio-CNG tractor, a great innovation, and being produced here in the UK at their Basildon factory. So an area where the UK is in the lead, funded actually with government grant support, but also smaller electric vehicles, more wacky things like gantry systems that can also run on biomethane. And then we've got the hydrogen opportunity being offered by JCB. But it's also, I think, the real excitement lies in the autonomous vehicles. The Small Robot Company is a company that's based not far from me in Wiltshire, developing these very neat robots to go around and do what they call per plant farming, so targeting disease and weeds in specific areas on fields, and allowing things to be done without the use of heavy vehicles, but also major developments in terms of robotics. And one of the leaders in this area is Harper Adams Agricultural College here in the UK, who for the last 6 years have been operating what they call a hands-free farm. And that's going to lead into what an even more exciting area of what they call swarm robotic systems, with smaller vehicles operating in tandem at a much smaller scale, battery powered, delivering tasks on farms. I think we also have to recognize that we have to promote gas fuels as a solution within government and within the industry. That it is not just a story, in my view, about biomethane being the only solution. Biopropane is a key part of what we're doing, albeit mainly imported at the moment. And obviously there is the sort of ambition for blue and ultimately green hydrogen. My key focus in terms of what I'm doing within the food and farming industry is that if we are going to be able to use these fuels, we need to be able to produce them at a local level or supply them at a local level. And this is going to require a degree of innovation. The vehicle in the middle of the right-hand picture is actually a vehicle developed by JCB to shift hydrogen around to their building sites. These sort of options also needed to be developed for moving biomethane around on farms. And I think, we will see much more of the opportunity to actually take biomethane that is being produced on farms and turn it into vehicle fuel for use in that local area and on that farm. And I'll just dwell on that for a few slides. So we have the potential to upgrade biomethane and not necessarily put it into the grid. There are smaller upgrade solutions now available from a number of technology OEMs, upgrading 30 to 60 cubic meters of biogas an hour into biomethane. That would be enough potentially to run 2 to sort of 5 trucks or tractors on a farm, and indeed allow fueling for vehicles that were collecting produce from the farm and delivering it to the market. We need to extend the network beyond the gas grid, and we need to also transition existing AD plants that are currently mainly focused on electricity generation with CHP engines. When these CHP engines reach the end of life or the FIT regime runs out, we want to avoid these plants becoming stranded assets. And the major opportunity there is to convert them into supply of local biomethane without necessarily having to put it into the grid. We need low capex solutions. We need to speed up the displacement of red diesel, and we need to develop CO2 capture technology to sit alongside these smaller upgrade solutions. But we have an adoption-ready fuel that is suitable for local off-grid use. We have also, in my view, an increasing technology leadership in the smaller scale off-grid biomethane sector, whether it's companies like Marches or Biogest who've been doing this for a while, or some of the new kids on the block like Biofactory, Benneman, and Waze, who are developing exciting modular solutions that can be deployed on site and actually allow farms to produce relatively small quantities of biogas and then upgrade it to biomethane if that's what they want to do, and tailoring the system to feedstock and location. We're seeing systems change in the powertrain, in the vehicles and the powertrains. One of the companies I've been working with recently is Brewdog. They have recently bought in some biomethane trucks from Scania to deliver beer from their factory, which has an AD plant on it, down into their distribution center. We've mentioned the other companies on the slides, but we have, I think, a major task ahead of us, and I think this is where the biogas industry needs to work with others to revise the ban on internal combustion engines for non-road applications and indeed other heavy vehicles. Wasundara made the point that the policy is in place that doesn't have the technology to deliver what is expected. So we need to focus on getting our policymakers, our politicians, to look again at the ICE ban based on the fact that we have technologies, whether it's biomethane, outside the gas grid, and the NFCCC has done a considerable amount of work on the conversion of CHP-AD to bio-CNG, and also to create the pathway for hydrogen, whether it's small-scale production on farms or distributing hydrogen to farms. And it's interesting to see that companies, not only JCB, but Hyundai, are developing non-inflationary gas hydrogen engines. And I think this is a crucial point. If you're in a low margin industry, whether it's farming, mining, construction, you can't afford to be required to buy a battery electric or even a fuel cell vehicle that costs 2 or 3 times the existing vehicle cost and won't have the functionality and the robustness that you need in the situation that you're working it in. And therefore we need high torque IC engines fueled by gas fuels to be a key part of our rural strategy. We've got the ability to create modular systems. We've got the ability to combine decentralized energy production with conversion to the fuels that farmers need, or brewers or other companies need to distribute their products. But we haven't really embraced the policy transition away from a sort of focus on, 10 years ago, we were trying to encourage AD with incentives, and we've got a green gas support scheme that's not working for off-grid production. We need to look at energy grants. We need to look at carbon incentives, and maybe there's even the potential for creating a CFD floor price for small-scale bioenergy. And if we can do that, I believe we can then develop a spectrum of gas fuels to run these clean ICE engines with, and do it based on a combination of gas fuels for larger vehicles and microgeneration to power the smaller vehicles that will also be increasingly seen on farms. We're going to change vehicle design. Weight needs to be reduced as part of efforts to improve soil health. We know that robotics is going to take time, but it's actually moving very fast. We have an opportunity in the UK to be suppliers of these technologies, not only in the UK market, but globally. We can develop modular storage and distribution systems, and we need to highlight the fact that while fuel cells may have a role in other sectors, they are ill-suited to rural needs, and gas fuels are the only game in town that's going to be non-inflationary. So we need to challenge policymakers on the future of internal combustion engines and their unrealistic focus on fuel cells. We need to support modular gas storage and distribution, and we need an integrated clean gas fuel supply strategy. I just want to reiterate, we need a non-inflationary replacement for diesel. We need to initiate the replacement process. Agriculture has not been included in policy efforts to encourage transition. We have to revisit the ICE ban, and we have to start looking at the deployment of smaller vehicles. And the contrast between the two pictures at the bottom of the slide is deliberate. At the moment, farming is reliant on a number of large, heavy vehicles, which in themselves can cause compaction on soils at a time when we're trying to improve soil health. Does the future lie in swarms of small vehicles running around on farms? It's too early to tell, but I think it's an exciting development. And to do this, we need to facilitate connectivity, and we need to see considerably more leadership from whichever government and whichever government department we have to involve in this. And one of the problems is that there are 3 or 4 departments involved. And I hope with some of the efforts of ADBA and others working in the industry, we can get systems change for rural fuels and rural vehicles. And that is the end of what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's a very good keeping to time too. So chairs are always delighted with speakers who manage to keep to time. And I'd like now please to turn to Rob Wood for our third presentation, looking at gas fueling infrastructure and the roadmap out to 2050. So I guess the real question, Rob, you're going to be addressing, or one of the questions is, if people are investing in biomethane as an HGV solution, are they going to be able to do that on all the routes that they're currently able to service?
I'll do my best. Okay, does that slide come up?
Yep.
As a full screen?
Yeah, nearly a full screen. You're there as well, which is great.
It's always a little bit of a mystery.
Very smart picture. A sort of dusk view of a big refueling station.
Yes, exactly. So this is Delft. So a station on a logistics park, junction 18 of the M1. What makes it just a little bit different from every other refueling station you see is the 4 cylindrical tanks that sit there. What they hold is LNG, liquefied natural gas, and it's that gas that's dispensing into the vehicles. Of course, LNG has been in the news a lot over the last 12 months because it's really replaced Russian gas as the main source of gas into Europe. So LNG, it comes from very large gas resources, really anywhere in the world. It's liquefied in order to really concentrate it, so you can then put it on a ship, and then you can sell it to wherever the market needs it. So over the last 12 months, a lot of LNG import terminals have been built in Europe to add to the existing terminals, and almost all the gas coming into Europe comes in this way. Once it gets to a terminal, one of two things happens. Vast majority of it is then warmed up, turn it back into gas, and goes into the gas pipeline system, and we all use that for cooking and heating. The other is what we do, which is we take the gas as cold gas, put it into a road tanker, and then transport it to one of our stations, put it into one of those large cylindrical tanks, and then discharge that into the vehicles we're refueling. What we then do is buy an equivalent amount of biomethane and mass balance between the two. So all the gas we sell is then deemed to be biomethane, and that's really the way any gas supplier does it, which is that mass balancing approach. What I'm talking about for my presentation is gas to transport, trucks very much like this one. Importantly, these trucks are coming directly off production lines now. So a few years ago, they were taken off to one side, and there were special purpose vehicles with a lot of manual intervention in order to produce them. That just isn't the case. 95% of the components are common to a diesel vehicle, and unless you're a bit of an anorak like me, you probably wouldn't notice a gas truck if it drove past you. The only real difference is the tank on the side of the vehicle and the way that tank is plumbed into the engine itself. So they're the vehicles I'm talking about, generally tractors with 2 or 3 axles and articulated and put-in trailers. The other thing I'm talking about is sort of gas stations and what creates a gas network. Here's some examples. You've already seen the first one, which is the picture in the top left-hand corner, which is a very large station. In fact, that's the largest gas station in Europe. The others are much smaller. Some are depot-based, some are small open access stations, and some are just for the use of a single customer. So they vary enormously in size, structure, and then cost. What we observe is a changing landscape. So government putting regulation in place to ban anything but zero emission vehicles from 2030 for cars, 2035 for lighter heavy goods vehicles, and 2040 for the heaviest heavy goods vehicles. But what we're seeing is individual companies are putting their own emission reduction targets in place well ahead of the government targets. So almost all the major companies, whether it be DHL, Marks and Spencer's, John Lewis, are now focused on their own carbon reduction and looking for ways they can achieve that. Almost all of them will have to look at transport and do things in the transport area to deliver those targets. Probably the most acute would be the logistics companies. So something like 95% of DHL's carbon emissions comes from their transport. So there is no way they can deliver their carbon reductions without changing the nature of their transport fleet. Looking at the different modes of operation and different service of vehicles, you have a wide range of different operations. So at one end of the spectrum, you have local delivery vans doing lots of stop-starts, delivering to individual households. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have long-haul heavy trucks moving long distances, sometimes across a continent. And life has been very easy in the past, where all of those vehicles would be refueled by diesel. It was very simple. The choice was very, very simple. And probably the hardest decision a truck operator, a fleet manager had to take was, do I buy a truck with one badge on it rather than another badge on it? But it was a pretty straightforward set of decisions. Life is now a lot more complicated because the same fuel choices won't exist. The lighter vehicles almost certainly will go EV. The heavy vehicles, that's where it gets very difficult. And the choices will probably be bioenergy, CNG, or hydrogen, because in those very high payload, long distance operations, the weight of the batteries, certainly given existing technology, may well prove to be prohibitive. So certainly the way we're looking at that, and we're working with our partners, BP is an investor in GasRex, they're one of our partners, is to look at how we develop refueling infrastructure that really accommodates those different requirements. So we're very focused on, not just a single fuel, but multiple fuels, recognizing that mixed fleet requirement and looking at how we can put low carbon fuel hubs in place in the right locations to create a network that genuinely gives truck operators the choice and ability to adopt low carbon vehicles. Just something on how different vehicle technologies compare and greenhouse gas savings. There's a long way to go in hydrogen to make that give it a strong carbon reduction case. Today, grey hydrogen consuming fossil gas or network electricity really doesn't reduce carbon very much. So it has to be combined with renewable electricity or carbon capture and sequestration to really create a strong case. By comparison, biomethane already delivers a strong carbon reduction, and by feedstock selection, it can produce the highest carbon reduction of really any of the alternatives. Worth also noting the cost of refueling infrastructure. Diesel, widespread, very easy to store, very easy to handle. So by far and away the lowest cost. Gas, a little bit more than that. The gas stations are more sophisticated. The metals used in their production are more sophisticated. You do have to keep gas cold or compressed, so more expensive. But that increase in cost versus diesel is insignificant compared to the cost of battery electric vehicle charging infrastructure or hydrogen vehicle infrastructure charging. So when one looks at these options, the cost of the refueling infrastructure really does need to come into the equation. And of course, the other part of that is the cost of the vehicle itself. Gas vehicles, a little bit more expensive than diesel. Electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles, a lot more expensive than diesel. So any of these alternatives, again, are covered at cost. And there will be a question, I suspect, around the cost benefit of how much it's going to cost to achieve the carbon benefits from those technologies. So some of the challenges in developing the refueling infrastructure. Well, it's needed where the HGV concentration is greatest. Certainly all the conversations that we have with our customers running large HGV fleets, they really do not want to deviate from their routes. They're masterful at minimizing lost time, utilizing vehicles and drivers to the high extent they can, and they simply do not want large stem mileage to be created out of any change to new fuels technologies. So that says to us, the refueling infrastructure will need to be in or close to large logistics parks, which is where the vehicles are running, or on or close to key highway nodes. The issue with that is planning restrictions lead to very high land values, because in those areas there's lots of competing demand. The largest alternative use will always be building another shed for logistics use. So land values are high in those areas. So then you get the issue, which is there a business case for investing in alternative fuels? And that can only exist if there's demand. And so where we find ourselves today with government policy not creating a clear outcome makes that very difficult to anticipate. Logistics companies, are so on the positive side though, as I've said, logistic companies are under pressure to reduce carbon emissions, and they do want to do the right thing. They do want to run low emission vehicles, and when the infrastructure is there, they tend to use it. So the example of the station I showed you earlier on at Delft, that station is now almost fully loaded. So we struggle to take on more capacity at that station, and maybe as evidence that once the infrastructure is there, then people will use it. Last point, capital investment for land development which is on the positive side, is often tied to meeting sustainability targets. So we're seeing landowners, logistics park developers now also being much more concerned about the buildings they put up, the infrastructure they put in place to ensure it's enabling their customers to live in carbon reduction. So it's becoming systemic far more so than we would have said a few years ago. So this is an example of what we're looking at. This is just a gas station, so it doesn't have the other fuels attached to it, but is a good demonstration of what we think is necessary. So this station is in a large logistics park, about 8,000 truck movements in and out of the park each day, covers about 1,000 acres, and has about 12 million square feet of sheds. So these would be the places that we would target for infrastructure. And when you look across the UK, we estimate there's about 100 locations that maybe not as large as Delft, that fall into the right sort of category where one can be reasonably confident of demand being there. And our view would be that about 100 stations starts to create a viable network. It would obviously need to be filled in by other refueling stations in depots and such like, but you then have a network that is usable by most operators. Inevitably, it's going to start in central areas where the concentrations of the vehicle is greatest, so along the main motorway spines of the UK, and as I said, in these logistics park. Our view is that bioenergy, CNG, remains the most viable way to reduce carbon reduction emissions in the short term, and that inevitably is going to be the starting point for underpinning the low carbon fuel development in these refueling hubs. Alternatives like EV and hydrogen will certainly emerge. They will grow, but in order for that to happen, there still needs to be significant upgrading of the supply chain, production of the fuel, the transmission of the fuel to the point of demand, and then the refueling stations themselves, in addition to development of the vehicle technology, although the vehicle technology is less of an issue. So the other thing that is a feature is the government launched a ZERF trial last year. The results have not been published, but it will be putting 140 million of funding into development of hydrogen battery truck refueling infrastructure. So again, that will be one of the mechanisms that will start to create a fueling network. And then putting all of that together, then our view on the potential demand for biomethane is about 5 million tonnes per year. That comes from 5.3 million commercial vehicles. I discount 4.6 million vans that I think are likely to run on EV. There's about 42,000 HGV registered each year. 19,000 are the heaviest tractor units that are most likely to be using gas. That leads to a market of about 130,000 tractor units. And if you triangulate either from the 130 tractor units or 50% of the HGV market, you get a potential demand of something like this, so about 5 million tonnes per year. So a very material opportunity for us all to be tackling.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. I think we'll leave questions until the end for everybody, if that's okay. As I said, I thought that was a very useful overview as well of potential. I certainly got a couple of questions there. Perhaps we could just move on to our final presentation before the question and answer session. Philip, are you there and ready to roll? Philip Feld, CEO of CNG Fuels.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping you can see this.
Yep.
Wonderful. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to hear us out today, and hopefully there'll be some good questions afterwards. So I've titled this presentation Biomethane is a Transport Fuel, the Pragmatic Solution. You'll probably understand why as we make it through here, and particularly in a sort of policy environment that has become very ideological and I would almost say dogmatic. And I hope you will understand a bit later on. And I'll also try to, for those slides I've got where Rob or Richard have sort of touched upon anything that's relevant, I'll try to move on fairly quickly so that we can get to questions afterwards. So CNG Fuels, I'm one of the co-founders. We founded the company back in 2014. We develop, build, own and operate very large public access bio-CNG stations across the UK. Rob mentioned that they are mainly focused on LNG. We are 100% focused on large CNG stations. 100% of the fuel that we've been dispensing through our network since September 2016 has been biomethane from a waste feedstock. It's important to understand that what goes into transport comes from a waste feedstock. I noticed there was a question on the chat regarding land use change, etc., etc. What goes into transport is pretty much all 100% from waste feedstocks, whether that be food waste, manures, etc., etc. We have plans to grow outside of the UK eventually, but as of today, we've got 10 stations, large stations in operation. And as of last year, the volume we dispensed into trucks grew by 62%. Whilst we grew 62% last year in dispensed volume, we're looking for the same growth rate there or thereabouts this year. What's important to understand is we founded the company back in 2014, and the growth so far has largely been held back by lack of refueling network. We've now got 10 stations in operation. We've got more in build. By mid 2024, we're expecting to have close to 20 stations in operation. And we're already now starting to see that only by having 10 stations operational, we are starting to see true mass adoption across our customer base. Some of our well-known customers are Waitrose, John Lewis, but I've put this one up here just to show that this is no longer a fuel that only the large PLCs are using to adopt. We've got second and third tier hauliers now also widely adopting this fuel. We're having new customers join us every month going forward. When I say second and third tier, it doesn't mean they're of lesser quality. I'm just talking of size. There might be family-owned businesses who have 100, 150, 200 trucks. We didn't really see those adopt 2 or 3 years ago, but this has now become a mainstream solution that is not only adopted by the large corporates. This is something now that is widely adopted across the industry, and where they can, they've now stopped ordering diesel trucks. So what's in it for the hauliers? Why are they doing this? Well, first of all, as also Rob mentioned, a lot of these companies have got very ambitious decarbonisation targets. Whilst we've got a net zero ambition here in the UK for 2050, a lot of our customers want to be 50% off diesel or 50% decarbonised by 2025. Some want to be 100% like John Lewis Partnership by 2028. If you want to do that, there's only one game in town essentially, and that is biomethane. You can't wait for maybe electric to come. You can't wait for hydrogen. And even if you want to go down the 100% biodiesel route, such as HBO, you will struggle because it's not really a reliable supply at a cost that makes sense for you. If you look at biomethane today, it says 83% here, greenhouse gas savings. That's only because those are based on reports going back a couple of years. As of today, our customers enjoy about 90 to 91% or 92% greenhouse gas savings compared to diesel baseline. As we start to source more and more biomethane from manure, we do expect to get close to 100% savings or go negative. So biomethane is here and now. It's widely adoptable. There's a lot of supply of biomethane that wants to come into transport. So this is something that, and this is one of the key drivers for why our customers are adopting. That said, nobody can afford to lose money and go green. It doesn't matter if you're a large PLC. If you lose a considerable amount of money compared to running a diesel baseline vehicle, you just can't afford it. Why? Because you might lose out on your competition. If you're a family-owned business, you certainly can't afford it because you might be on 2 to 3 or 4% profit margin. But by going down the biomethane route, you have a cheaper fuel. Yes, the vehicle is more expensive, but that means that you do actually have a positive payback here. And that's extremely important to understand. If you want to adopt battery electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles today, you are unfortunately in a situation where they are expensive, the fuel vector is expensive, and therefore no one can really afford it. By going down the biomethane route, you get to save emissions today, and you actually have a positive payback, and that's important. So where are we on policy? Because of course, biomethane sounds like a great fuel. So why aren't policymakers so excited about it? So in the UK, as has been mentioned previously, by 2035 and 2040, all non-zero tailpipe emission vehicles will be banned. So rigid vehicles in 2035, Arctics in 2040. The EU, however, has taken a quite interesting turn of events just in the last couple of weeks. Everything looked like it was lined up for the EU just to almost rubber stamp through that cars around 2035 and HGVs post 2040, they would have a similar type of ban to the UK. That's now been stopped. A final vote was called off at last moment and has been postponed indefinitely. Why? Because you have huge member states now coming in and saying, do you know what? Electric is not the only solution. It's too ideological. It misses out a lot of the nuances. Or, as one minister here in Italy says, the ban is suicide for European industry and a gift to China. So why are they saying that? Well, I've got some slides that will hopefully highlight and spark some discussions afterwards for where those points are coming from. So if we're looking at an electrify everything solution, and these are McKinsey, this is a McKinsey table, by the way, this isn't something I've made. So if we're looking at an electrify everything solution, we are looking at a vastly different landscape today with regards to minerals, metals that we need in quantities that need to be produced at unprecedented scale within a time frame that is extremely short. In the red box here, you see what is required for the electrify everything agenda. On the left-hand side, outside of the box, you see you don't really need much of anything other than what we've already got today. So if we then move on and we look at just another image here, another chart that comes from the IEA. Now, the IEA aren't just sort of any random organization out there. They're an intergovernmental organization. They represent 75% of global energy demand. As I'm sure a lot of you know, they were set up after the global oil crisis in 1973. They provide policy recommendations, analysis, and data on the global energy sector. So they're a bit like, you know, one of the entities you would go to if you wanted to know the status of what was actually happening today and what could be achieved in the future. So here you see that an EV, typical EV, uses 6 times more minerals than a conventional vehicle. Now, we shouldn't only focus on EVs, of course, because if you want to run EVs and you want to achieve net zero by an electrify everything agenda, that means you need wind turbines, you need photovoltaic, you know, solar, and you need battery storage and so on and so forth. So you will need a lot of minerals and a lot of processing capacity. Now, if we then look at processing capacity and you say, all right, let's say we can extract all of these minerals, which you'll probably see in a bit, is highly doubtful. What you see is that China has got around about 50% on average of the global processing capacity of all of the minerals and metals that we need. Now, I'm not picking on China here. I'm just pointing out that maybe in light of what we've seen now, given the Ukraine war and our dependencies on certain countries, it might not be a wise strategy to actually put all our eggs in one basket with regards to certain countries that will process the critical materials we need in order to achieve an electrify everything strategy. Moving on to the next one, I've titled this one Minerals Blindness. And by the way, that's not me saying that. That comes from the Geological Survey of Finland. We've been around for a long, long time, 400 people, government-backed, who are there to provide advice as to what can be done with minerals and metals, not just in Finland, but globally. They issued a report in 2021, updated it this year. And as you see from the table here, I'm just going to do a couple of highlights there. And this is just a snapshot of some of the metals, some of the minerals that we need to use here. If we look at copper, and they've then assessed how much copper do we actually need globally to achieve net zero. They then matched that up against the global reserves of copper, which is then coming from the US Geological Survey. And then they've said, all right, so let's say we take all of those reserves, because we don't actually know if we can discover any more. That only gets us to about 20%. So we are 80% short. And even if we could find the rest that we need, it will take us close to 190 years to produce the copper we need just to get to net zero. And of course, we want to be at net zero by 2050, so anyone can see that that's not going to work. Then you've got nickel, lithium, and so on and so forth. I haven't got time to go into the details here. I think you understand the picture. But then people will say, well, hang on. If we're going to electrify everything, that will just drive greater demand for something. And of course, the supply side will follow. No, probably not. If you then look at where are we, and here I'm just looking at copper, so I'm not looking at lithium and all the other stuff. Where are we on copper discoveries? Where are we on copper production? Well, over the last 10 years, a lot of money has been poured into exploring for copper, but they're not really finding much. Okay, so that's clearly not a good picture, because we need to discover colossal new deposits of copper in order to get to where we need to be on net zero. And by the way, the discoveries they are making are no longer 5 or 7% copper ore. They're discovering 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% copper ore, which then means that the copper costs 5, 10, 15x to produce, which then drives up the cost. And more importantly, it's taking a very, very long time from you discover a deposit to actually managing to produce it. So previously took about 3 to 4 years, as you can see at the bottom here, back in the 1950s, 3 to 4 years from you would discover a deposit to you could actually produce it. Today, it takes minimum 16 years to do that. To anyone who thinks that, sure, there are 145 major copper discoveries out there, that all of those will just be switched on and they'll provide all the minerals we need over the next 10, 15, 20 years, sorry to say so, but they're delusional. Why? Because 114 out of those 145 major copper discoveries haven't even achieved a feasibility study check. So that means they aren't even ready to draw down capital and start to be built. So that means there is no way short term that this can be achieved. However, this is what the Finns say. Maybe they've been spending too long time in the sauna. Maybe they haven't, maybe they're not thinking clearly. Maybe it's just their view. So let's look at another view. This is S&P Global, got 40,000 employees, one of the leading, financial information companies out there. They provide market intelligence, analytics, and so on and so forth. I don't usually read some of the wording from slides here, but I'll just highlight the stuff that's in bold. Once again, this is not outdated information. This came out in July of last year, so 8 months ago. Copper, the metal of electrification, which I'm sure we can all agree with, given that it's been around for 7,000 years, is essential to all energy transition plans. But the potential supply-demand gap is expected to be very large. Unless massive new supply comes online in a timely way, the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 will be short-circuited and remain out of reach. Okay, that's not terribly positive, but maybe it's not all doom and gloom. Let's read on and see what they say more here. The chronic gap between worldwide copper supply and demand will have serious consequences across the global economy and will affect the timing of net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, not terribly good either. Copper scarcity may emerge as a key destabilizing threat to international security. That certainly doesn't sound good. And this is just one mineral we're talking here. And of course, we all remember the slide hopefully you remember the slide a couple of slides back with regards to processing capacity. China holds a preeminent position in copper smelting, 47%, refining 42%, and usage 54%. Continued trade tensions and other forms of competition between the United States and China could affect the copper market going forward. Probably slightly understated, not to scare off whoever's going to read this. So let's summarize. Getting us back to something that's here and now, that's realistic, that actually works, and that is pragmatic. We know that biomethane works well. It's growing rapidly, both the fuel that we dispense into trucks and the LNG that Gastric provides is growing rapidly. Why? Because we have 100% renewable and sustainable fuel, and it's easily scalable to meet growing demand. We have a cost profile, not only for the fuel, but the vehicles today that's attractive. This is not something that's going to add 100, 200, 300% to the pence per mile cost, which some of the other solutions do. Circular economy, which was pointed out previously in Richard's presentation. And geopolitical risk. I think we should all think about what's been going on over the last 12 to 18 months when it comes to geopolitical risks and security of supply for some of the key energy sources we need, for some of the key elements that we need to drive a modern civilization. Ideological dead ends will not get us to net zero. That is for sure. I can tell you now that the ban that is in place in the UK for 2035, 2040 cannot be met for a number of reasons that we haven't got time to discuss exactly now, but everything from infrastructure to the vehicles, to the energy vectors and so on and so forth. And we need a pragmatic, multi-solution approach. I'm not claiming that biomethane is the one silver bullet that fixes everything, but it is part of a multifaceted and a multi-solution approach where, sure, battery electric, sure, hydrogen, all of these have a role to play, but we need to become pragmatic, not dogmatic. And with that, I will drop my slides and hopefully there will be some Q&A.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was very useful as well. Can I abuse the chairmanship by just kicking off with a couple of questions? And the one that I particularly wanted to ask, and I don't know whether it's easy for one or both of you to say, but biomethane obviously at the moment can be delivered for transport through the vector either of CNG or of LNG. My understanding is that LNG obviously is delivered at a very low supercooled temperature and is about 3 times as energy dense as CNG. Does this actually, I mean, are you going to go head to head as a vector on this on all ranges, or are there natural range determined factors which mean that some people will go for CNG, some people will go for LNG, or are you both going to be a sort of Sonny Betamax and you know, is it somebody's going to come out on top?
So I would go with that first, Philip.
Go for it.
So it depends on the vehicle operation, which one suits you better. Generally speaking, I'd say CNG it's easier to refuel vehicles. It's easier to handle because it's, you know, compressed and ambient temperature. But as you said, Chris, the limitation is the energy density. LNG benefits from that greater energy density, so you need less space to store the fuel for a given amount of distance. So if you're running long distance trucks and you're running them very heavily, constantly, particularly if the refueling infrastructure isn't very well developed, you would favour LNG. If you're running shorter trips, you have less range anxiety, you have greater access to refueling, then I think you would go CNG. So it depends entirely on the nature of the operation. So it is true to say that Philip and I cross over with some customers, but it's also true to say there are a large number of customers we simply don't cross over on.
Right. Philip, do you want to write a reply?
No, yeah, sorry. I completely agree with that. And it's also just back to our mantra, I think, here, that there's no one silver bullet here. Different fuel vectors will take you know, will appeal to certain customers, will appeal to certain duty cycles and so on and so forth. And I think, you know, the reality is at this point in time, without knowing exactly how many vehicles Rob and his colleagues refuel every day or others do, about 1.5% to 2% of long haul HGVs in this country today probably run on biomethane. We've got 98% of the problem still to solve. You know, okay. There's so much of a cake left here to resolve that I don't see that as a problem.
Well, let me also ask then, just in terms of the range issue, and I mean, you were both very compelling on costs and so forth. How does it look in terms of range if you are as a haulier investing in potentially a new diesel now compared with CNG, compared with LNG?
Range, are you talking operational range here as in how far you can drive them, or are you thinking how? Well, I mean, UK haulage is slightly different than on the continent. It is heavily focused on back to base mainly, which means that you can largely, you know, complete your journey whether you're running a CNG vehicle or a diesel vehicle, with some exceptions, to be honest. A typical fleet typically keeps a vehicle for 5 years for the first user of the fleet. Some a bit longer, some a bit shorter, but on average 5 years. So as such, what we're seeing today is, if you remember the slide I had with all the logos on, the vast majority of those, if we have a refueling station close by, or Rob's developing one, or someone else is doing that, then they will no longer be ordering diesel vehicles. But some of them have to continue to order diesel vehicles for a certain period of time because there isn't a refueling station as of today, but we will hopefully have one built in 2 years, or Rob or someone else will have done so. So we've reached a tipping point now, and now it's really just about the vehicles are here, the fuel is here. Now it's just really about getting more infrastructure.
Chris, could I just add that I think it's important in getting the political message across within the policy making spectrum is that we have gas fuels as a solution. It doesn't have to be an argument about which gas fuel. The important thing is to say that the only solution in town for replacing diesel is gas fuels, and that market will evolve if the government gives it the ability to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of buy that, except that obviously we know a lot from economics about network effects. And, network effects are important, and it is potentially, I assume, going to make it easier to persuade hauliers to convert to gas if they know that there's one simple solution, rather than them having to go to a secondary decision, which is, okay, I'm going to go to gas, but am I going to CNG or am I going to LNG? Or is there actually a technology that can run on both?
Yeah, well, there isn't really a technology that can run on both. You either buy, a CNG vehicle or an LNG vehicle, because the way you contain the gas is different. There's no real simple answer to your question, Chris, because it does depend on the operation of the vehicle. So if you're running a very heavy vehicle which has got 3 axles, then you only have a limited amount of space available for storing the fuel.
Right.
Now, if you're running that locally, it's really not an issue. So CNG or LNG would be a perfectly good fuel. If you're running at long distance and you don't have a refueling network, then you're forced down the energy route, because that's the only way you can get sufficient fuel on the vehicle. So it's a bit like other technologies. It's going to come down to individual operations. What vehicles are you buying? Why are you buying those? How are you running them? And that will really dictate your technology choices.
Okay.
And I think certainly where I come out on this is there's no right or wrong answer between LNG or CNG. It very much is horses for courses, and I guess as Richard was saying, we're as an industry, we're far better off promoting the benefits of gas as the alternative fuel, not really getting too hung up about the debate of how it's delivered.
Okay, just one other point, and I don't know if anybody else, I'm looking out for participants who want to put their hand up for a question, but this is a sort of slightly skeptical one. As I understand it, there are no longer any HGV manufacturers left in the UK. And as a result, we are effectively going to be accepting the solution that is mandated by the European Union. Now, does that, so, what is actually the space left for British policymakers? I'm not talking about Richard's area of agriculture here, because obviously there is space there. But in terms of long distance haulage, nobody's going to make a particular truck just for the UK market. So does this effectively mean that we're waiting on what Philip was describing as that slight logjam in the EU about the future of trucks, or am I missing something here?
No, I think you are pointing out the obvious, that unfortunately UK policymakers haven't quite gotten onto yet. We do manufacture some trucks in this country, but they are basically DAF, which again is a Dutch company, which again is owned by a US conglomerate. But of course, those vehicles are, of course, whatever they build.
It's an assembly plant, yeah.
Pretty much, yes. So we are, once again, I'm often criticised for being a bit too outspoken here, but we are delusional in this country if we think that the truck manufacturers are going to have special trucks for the UK that will only do UK emission standards by 2035 and 2040. Sure, they do 6x2 trucks today, and they do right-hand drive, and they do other modifications of their existing ones, but to think that they are going to sort of fall in line with UK ambitions when the UK market is maybe 5% of their overall sales, or 10% or 8% of their sales, is not going to happen. So we have some very interesting years ahead of ourselves here, I think, and particularly now with very strong voices in the EU. I mentioned Italy. Germany are now coming out as well and saying this isn't going to work. You know, we've got other member states as well saying we need a more pragmatic approach to this. And I think that the UK will have to follow suit, whether they want to or not.
Rob, you're nodding. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw this on gas trucks. So the heavy truck market in the UK is predominantly 3-axle, and we had to wait, maybe 3 years for vehicles to be introduced in that configuration, because the vehicles that first came into the UK, of course, were for European markets where the manufacturers see much of their market. So I think we're absolutely right, and I see it in exactly the same way as you both do.
Okay, Richard, do you want to give us a blast for British independence or no? Do you agree with that general?
I agree entirely. I mean, I think we need to look at opportunities to develop technologies in the UK that, you know, whether it's in my sector of the agri-food sector, you know, it's hugely impressive what New Holland and JCB and others are doing, but it's a drop in the ocean, and we are reliant on OEMs that operate outside the UK. So we've got to work with them.
Yeah,
the whole of this presentation has really been premised on the fact that the HGV market looks very appropriate for biomethane. Can I ask us also slightly off the wall question? Because my understanding is that LNG is actually extremely energy dense, even more so, for example, than kerosene. So there is a possibility that biomethane could be an aviation fuel, and that might be a greater need even than HGV. Should we be talking about this at all?
Oh, I can't quite remember where the energy density sits versus kerosene.
Well, I just looked it up beforehand. I've got 40 mJ per kilogram for kerosene and 54 mJ per kilogram for LNG.
So it's not using it in aviation isn't something I've really come across. If you're looking for high density energy, then that is clearly one of those. The size of the market is such, well, I don't think it's a decision. It's either that or this or something else. You know, the market for energy is huge and set to become a lot larger. And the fact it's responded so quickly and replaced almost all of the Russian gas is evidence of that. And what that will lead to is quite a number of gas projects that were maybe sitting on oil company shelves being pulled off and now developed, I suspect, very rapidly. So it's a fungible market. It will respond to the market demand. The energy industry has always done that and been surprising by the speed with which it reacts. So I think LNG will have a place in road transport, it will have a place in marine transport, and it may have a place in aviation as well. And that really doesn't cause me any concerns from a supply perspective.
Great. I'm slightly, you know, obviously we do have a limited potential in the long run. And as Wassen's presentation showed, that even if we were using all of the UK's potential, I mean, obviously we import a lot of energy, we could go on importing biomethane and as an LNG product, but it would, even if it was used all for HGVs, it would only be about 70% of use. So I'm slightly nervous about the sort of general way in which those of us who are enthusiasts for biomethane say it's great for agriculture, it's great for HGV. Yes, let's use it for aviation fuel. We're going to use it to heat people's houses as well and keep the gas grid going. And actually, you know, there are limits in terms of the potential. Now, the market will in the end sort this out. And I suspect that the market will sort it out in a way that, you know, is obvious for biomethane in those very high density applications like HGVs and aviation rather than the lower density ones. But I don't know what your views are on that.
Well, what you're touching upon is where we in the UK government policymakers should be, and that is to say, listen, there are lots of solutions out there. We as policymakers, we honestly do not know which one's going to win. So let's take a technology neutral approach. The market is going to drive a lot of this. Also recognize we are an island with 60+ million people. We haven't got much of an industrial base left. And if we pick a winner, which they essentially have, to say it's going to be batteries or it's going to be hydrogen, it's going to be zero tailpipe, then we are entirely beholden to everything that goes outside, that goes on outside of this country. Now, we will be beholden to lots of stuff that goes on outside this country anyway, but the premise that someone, a civil servant or two or 5 politicians, ministers are going to know what the correct solution is 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now is let's be honest, is ridiculous. All right. We should take a technology neutral approach and then the market will sort it out.
Sounds like sensible advice to me. When I was doing my basic economics, we were looking at some of the picking winners horror stories of the UK government in the 1960s, and it wasn't great, it has to be said. I've got a question from Vicky Crossthwaite. Vicky.
Hi everyone. Hi Rob. Long time
Vicky.
no see. You know, given the nature, I mean, obviously I've been in this field as long as you, and also Phil on this CNG LNG journey. You know, it's taken what, almost in the order of magnitude of what, about 8 years so far in trying to convince the government around, you know, utilizing alternative clean energy fuels. You know, do we feel that the government is going to change their thinking around this alternative fuels, or are they just going to continue to be led by the OEMs dictating what trucks they bring to our market, or really about what it is we should be doing now? Because I think, you know, from my experience and exposure, you know, I think we fought for a long time around the advocacies and policy around excise duty and, you know, fixing that excise duty to help with this, closing the gap on the total cost of ownership compared to diesel. But do you feel that the government still have this, how do we call it, doubt in their mind that whilst it has a CO2 benefit, this methane slip myth that they perhaps still hide behind a little bit is preventing them from you know, encouraging biomethane in the UK market?
Maybe, yeah, I'll just provide a couple of comments and I'll let Rob go. First of all, I just need to, I think, you correct one thing you said, and that is, you know, the you know, government's being led by what the OEMs want to supply with regards to vehicles. On the contrary, they're not being led by them at all. They've decided, they've made up their minds what they want, regardless of what the OEMs can provide. If you go and speak to the OEMs individually, not one of them is supportive of an electrify everything agenda by 2035, 2040, because they know it can't be done. And that's me having spoken to, you know, CEOs of some of the very large truck manufacturers, where they say we just can't do this. You know, we certainly won't be able to achieve it within the timelines they want. So the UK's got a different agenda here, and that is they've decided they want to electrify everything, and how that green electricity is going to be produced, how it's going to be distributed, how it's going to be put into vehicles is sort of something that doesn't really bother them, but it will bother them eventually. You know, are they going to change their views on biomethane? They are mildly supportive of biomethane. Could they do more? Absolutely. They could be a lot more vocal and a lot more supportive of it. Are they concerned by what used to be methane slip? No, I don't think that's an issue anymore. This is more about, you know, ideological thinking that everything has to be zero tailpipe, and then they work their way back from that, and they're soon going to find out it can't be done, and then it'll be interesting to see what kind of off ramp they come up with.
Rob, do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think policy will change, because I think it's when you're a long way off targets having to be met, so 2035, 2040, it's very easy to have a policy that says electrical hydrogen is the only thing that we'll accept. As you get closer to those targets and you realise the cost of those policy decisions, I think we may then see some slight changes in direction. It's already happening, of course.
Can I ask, where did it? I mean, it seems to me sort of blatantly obvious that there's going to be a change in direction because the technology is simply not there and doesn't look as if it's going to be there. But so it's just a question of time before policymakers deal with this. But I mean, am I not right in thinking that the zero tailpipe thing was as much an influential a view in Brussels as in London? So where did it come from? Why was it? Why did?
Well, I think we had a period of time when each government was trying to trump the other in terms of setting more aggressive carbon reduction targets, and so logic and sense and understanding how those targets were going to be delivered sort of went out the window. We're going to be the boldest show in town. We're going to set the strictest targets. We're going to get there before everyone else. Seemed to be the prevailing approach to policy making. So I sort of think that's a bit where it came from. Now, if you asked government, what sits behind it, they'd say, well, we're trying to encourage innovation. And I think we'd all get behind that. We'd all love to see zero emission vehicles. We'd all like to have a zero emission world and reduce, get the planet back to where it needs to get to. But at times you also have to be deeply pragmatic and say what's really possible and what's going to get delivered in the time frame. And you can be the victim of some of these targets by denying all the steps that you could do before getting to meet those big targets, and actually be in a worse position than you would have been had you been more pragmatic. And I sort of feel that's where policy is at the moment. It's really very unhelpful. Laudable objectives, but implementation is just going to suffer.
So still waiting for the perpetual motion machine.
Exactly.
Pretty much.
I think there's a huge issue of embedded dogmatism within officials within the key government departments. I know from discussions with JCB that, with their hugely innovative hydrogen internal combustion engine, okay, it's ahead of the curve in terms of the availability of the fuel, but they have had a real battle trying to persuade officials that their solution should be part of the spectrum of technologies available. And I think, we've been subject to excessive dogmatism in a number of areas under the current government, and I think this is one of them. And I think it's up to the industry to make a better case for the future of gas fuels versus the obsessive view of electrification for anything. And I think, actually the rather narrow argument that I've been talking about for rural areas, I think is a key part of this. Most Conservative MPs have rural constituencies. They need to understand that their constituencies are not going to be serviced with electric vehicles, and we have to use the resources available on and off grid to create a flexible solution. And it will be multiple solutions, as it will be in agriculture. But dogmatic civil servants and dogmatic politicians are not helping.
Let me just For the Ben. Sorry, Chris. I'll be.
I've got a question I want to bring in, but okay. Philip, go on. Yes.
All right. I'll be brief, but maybe just so that the people listening to this also understand the economic scale of the issue or problem we've got here. So one of our typical large public access stations costs about £5 million to build. We can refuel 600 to 800 trucks on biomethane every day. We sat down not earlier this year, last year, and said, okay, we want to refuel as many vehicles as possible on only hydrogen through a refueling station. The most we could come up with was 250 trucks per day. So you're about a third of what you could do with biomethane. The station would cost 40 million, 8x. And the vehicles themselves cost 5x. Now, that's not me being negative, because I'm an entrepreneur. I want to provide our customers with a solution that they can use. That's me being realistic. Now, how are we going to bridge that between now and 2035 and 2040? Can't be done unless we are going to 4x the cost of logistics in this country, which would break the economy.
So I'd certainly like to see the Department of Transport's bid for extra public spending to the Treasury on that, and what the response is that they're likely to get. I've got Martin Flack. Would you like to come in with your question, please?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Hi to everybody. The issue I just wanted to raise, really picking up on the conversations that's been going on, is there's a very interesting report from the Transport Committee published just a few days ago, where they've really laid in quite strongly to government in terms of the lack of planning for the future and the need to look seriously at biofuels as at least the stepping stone to get to a point where zero becomes a possibility. I think one of the big issues we have is that Westminster is in an area where air quality becomes an issue. So everybody looks, how do we solve air quality problems? We have a zero tailpipe emission vehicle. But the majority of the country does not have problems with air quality. It has problems with global warming, which is about the carbon emissions. So for vehicles running in the rural areas, as has just been said, a vehicle running on a zero carbon fuel is a perfectly good answer.
Martin, thanks for that. I'd just point out your majority of the country in terms of land area, of course, you're absolutely right. But in terms of population, the vast majority of the country live in settlements of more than 100,000 people. So the air pollution issues are non-negligible, and particularly in the big cities. Any responses? Rob?
To Martin's point, no.
Okay. That's fine. I don't, thank you very much for that. I don't see any other hands up. I hope that that's not a technology reason, but I think that was actually a very useful and helpful canter around the issues. I'm completely convinced of the role of biomethane in these otherwise extremely hard to abate sectors, and I suspect that we perhaps should have had a bit of a section on aviation as well as on heavy goods vehicles, but I'm absolutely convinced of the role for HGVs, and I think the technology is going to drive us towards that, whatever policymakers think. They have to, in the end, if they want to make a real change, live in the real world in which people have to struggle with decisions which actually cost money and cost shareholder capital and need to make some sort of sense. And if biomethane can do what it says on the tin in terms of decarbonising the sector quickly and at low cost, it seems to me to be pretty much a no-brainer. I think that perhaps for future discussion, I thought that Richard's presentation on agriculture was really important, and I'm particularly thinking within the UK that a lot of the potential growth for AD, for biogas, is using agricultural feedstocks of one form or another. So we have to think of ways which don't use the gas grid for obvious reasons, because Richard was pointing out a lot of these AD plants, potential AD plants, aren't going to be near or on the gas grid. How do we get the output to some of the potential users? And that's perhaps something for another day. But I thought it was a very useful. Thank you very much for all of our participants. Thank you, Wasim, for setting the stage with a very good opening presentation, to Richard for his overview on agriculture, which is, I think, one of the biggest areas where we really still are not even beginning to get a grip on what we need to do to decarbonize agriculture. And it's a tremendous missed opportunity, given what is the need to rethink all of agricultural support post-Brexit, that we're not putting decarbonisation in as a much heavier element in the whole planning of new support regimes for agriculture. And thank you very much too to Rob and to Philip. I'm going to watch this space on CNG versus LNG, and I've noticed that you're both very much stressing the advantages of biomethane, and may the best person win when it comes to the vector. But I have absolutely no doubt that you're going to get there. Thank you very much indeed to everybody for joining, and please do keep us in touch with any developments if you are in this field, and give us feedback. We need to represent your views to policymakers as well. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks all. Cheers. Thanks, Chris.